This is the We're Nearly There podcast. I am Melinda McClymans. I'm your host today, and I am just sharing some learnings. I'm going to talk about one of my key learnings from Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. He emphasizes empathy over almost every other factor when it comes to negotiation. And We're Nearly There is all about the skills we need to build the future we want, especially collaboration skills. And the use of empathy in negotiation is a great example of a so-called soft skill actually being used in a really hard way, or as a kind of what I like to say is a hard skill, because it's learnable and a lot of it really is just code, human code. And just to give a little bit of background on the author, he's basically combining his experience as a hostage negotiator with research and evidence about communication, and especially how to read people, because that's what negotiators really focus on. And it's an awesome book. You should definitely read it. It really will turn around a lot of wrong thinking in your mind. One of my favorite things he talks about in the book is how to say no and the value of no, and how actually no is really essential for communication, and actually getting things done and actually negotiating. And that he says a negotiation doesn't start until there's a no. So there's a lot of stuff like that, a lot of gems in the book. I really have enjoyed reading it. But empathy is really my focus here for the next maybe half hour or so. I'm going to do these mornings from now on just to keep the podcast going, keep the momentum going during busy times. Right now I've got some projects in addition to my full-time job, so I don't have as much time to schedule guest speakers and things like that. But I do have some exciting people who've agreed to talk, and I will get them lined up soon. So I thought I would start just with something scientific. So here is an image of the brain. And when we're talking about empathy, there are a lot of connotations for that word. And I want to focus on the intellectual connotations, or the intellectual definition of empathy, like really using your brain power to understand different perspectives, to understand your own perspective, but in reflection of other different perspectives from your own. And that takes a lot of high level brain power. Okay, so right now we're looking at just an open source image of the brain, but I'm going to read from Bessel van der Kolk, and this is another awesome book, The Body Keeps the Score, another must read by Bessel van der Kolk about the brain and trauma. But it's so much more than just those things. It's really about humanity. So empathy resides in the prefrontal cortex. And this is where planning and anticipation, sense of time and context, inhibition of inappropriate actions, and empathic understanding are located in our brains. So let me read that again. Planning and anticipation. So it's like, and my background's in education. So we have to learn, every PhD student has to learn about child development, even if you're not going into that field, because it's such a critical aspect of how adults learn, actually, to understand our brains and their development. And right around the age of 7, that area of the brain, the front part, the prefrontal cortex, that's when it really starts impacting the way we think, the way we perceive the world, and what we're able to manage in life. And before that age, or before the prefrontal cortex comes online, planning and anticipation aren't really a thing. So that's why kids don't really have a strong sense of time. You know, they don't have a good sense of consequences, and that's why they really need caretakers until that age to kind of tell them no, and explain, not so much explain, but just keep them from unintended consequences until they're able to learn. So that's a big shift toward adulthood, is understanding consequences. But that's also where empathic understanding is. So empathic understanding, empathy isn't just feeling someone else's pain. In fact, I think sometimes that's exaggerated or overemphasized, rather, because, I mean, if you think about it, emotions are very strong and can overwhelm us, and we have our own emotions. I don't know if it's definitely not always a good idea to really, feel someone else's pain. You should understand them. But actually, the key thing is just, what people really need from us isn't necessarily for us to just fully feel their pain, but to understand them, and so they feel heard and understood. And that's what this book really brings home. And also what Never Split the Difference brings home. So that empathy is just, it's so powerful for human development and human life. And the other thing about the brain to think about is, if you look at this image, if you can see the brain stem, that's the reptilian brain. We all still carry that with us, fight or flight. There's also research talking about survival in terms of tend and befriend, because we're social. Humans are social animals. But we have these core behaviors and reactions that are, they can seem unavoidable, right? But according to van der Kolk, this system, the prefrontal cortex area, can help to shape our reactions coming from what he calls the emotional brain, which is actually the limbic system in addition to this brain stem. And I'm sure, you've heard those terms, limbic and reptilian brain before, and how they're the source of all of our bad behavior. And it's because, that fear is very strongly tied to our survival instincts and into our DNA, and that's how we've survived. So it is a major factor. But the good news is, through development of self-awareness, we can change what he calls the emotional brain. And so that's really powerful. But it's also how we understand other people's experiences and emotions. Again, not necessarily like feeling their pain, but understanding their perspective in a way that makes their feelings and reactions make sense. So that's the key, is, and one of the things that he goes to in Splitting the Difference a lot is, whenever someone seems to be irrational, that's when you should actually get curious. I mean, rather than dismissing them, or definitely rather than getting angry at them, which is, very tempting, let's be honest. When you're communicating with somebody and they seem to be reacting in a way that doesn't make any sense, usually it actually does make sense. You just have to understand where they're coming from. So that's kind of what that Splitting the Difference is all about, in many different ways throughout all the chapters. But again, van der Kolk talks about how empathy really does play a critical role in our lives, because it's how we're able to make each other feel safe. When we seek to understand each other and understand the other person's view, we really, and this is a term that, like I say, build trust, but the term in Splitting the Difference is build empathy. And I think that's really kind of a fun term, because it's kind of a spin on build rapport, because you think about negotiators as these like slick salesmen almost, like kind of, unethical people that are manipulative, right? Like that are just trying to build rapport. And how many times have you thought, oh, that person's trying to build rapport, and you're thinking about it in terms of like they're kissing up to you, or they're trying to get something from you and you feel it, but actually that's not a good it's not a good thing to do, period. But it's actually not effective in negotiation either because people feel it. So he makes that distinction. And he said, I think he very intentionally chooses build empathy as the term. And I like that. I think that's really interesting because it's kind of like building what in intercultural pedagogy is called perspective consciousness. And it's, when you're teaching students to learn about different cultures, you're trying to build perspective consciousness so that they don't approach a cultural phenomenon as though it's irrational or crazy or horrible. Although that is a very natural reaction sometimes to certain cultural practices. If you're not familiar with them, it's an absolutely wonderful reaction. In my opinion, it's an honest reaction, but you need to get over that judgment of it as quickly as possible, because you need to learn to be curious about it and to try to, understand, well, why? What are the underlying factors? What are the motivations? How did that, over time come to be a practice in that culture? So I think there's some very interesting similarities between developing negotiation skills with developing cultural awareness, so I would love to explore that with the author at some point. Who knows, maybe he would even be willing to come on the show. But he's pretty famous right now, so we'll see. But you can find him on a lot of different podcasts right now. And there's also Eva Pompadouris, and she's also somebody who did a lot of what she calls interviewing, but similar, getting to the truth in a situation. In her case, she was interviewing criminals to get confessions, though, so it's a little bit different, but it's a lot of similar thoughts and ways of perceiving communication. But according to Vanderkolk, feeling listened to and understood changes one's physiology. Okay. Meaning it changes your health, your whole being. The brain is connected to our whole body. Being able to articulate a complex feeling and having our feelings recognized lights up our limbic brain so that reptile responds feeling happy, creates an aha moment. But in contrast, if you're met by silence and incomprehension, he says it kills the spirit. It kills the spirit. And I mean, wow, if that doesn't motivate all of us to work on our building empathy skills, I don't know what does, because we need, we're the ones we've been waiting for, as Alice Walker says, if we think that we're going to be able to collaborate without being able to do this for each other, it's really no wonder collaborations are so frustrating a lot of the time and they fall apart. This podcast, it has a very Pollyanna-ish focus, kind of a, optimistic focus about the future. But actually, what I'd like to talk about most in this podcast are the difficulties and the issues. And why? Because if you sweep them under the rug, then they remain an issue. But if you find the solutions for them, it's not. And what I'm really trying to do at this point with the podcast is find other problem solvers and other builders with a similar mindset and build an audience there. I'm a big believer in starting with, shared core values to build something great. And, and from that community to reach out then and, do more kind of trainings and outreach and things like that, for people that maybe aren't, they just haven't encountered this kind of thinking or had experiences of change that were positive. So yeah, human communication isn't meant to be a mere exchange of information. If it's the right kind of communication, it actually satisfies a core need for mental health. And there's a lot of, discourse in the medical community about social determinants of health and well-being, and how it's really important to have friends. It's really important to have community to be healthy. And I think it's the mental health and the brain health is so connected to our, it's connected directly to our nervous system, which is connected to all of our organs and everything. So it just really makes so much sense. Another thing that van der Kolk says is that communicating fully is the opposite of being traumatized. So that's the other thing about trauma and community, is that when scary things happen, and they will, so sometimes things happen, they actually don't have to become a trauma. Like, that's one of the things I'm trying to deprogram in my thinking. Like, I might say something like, oh, a traumatic event, to describe, something unexpected and very harsh that can happen, like the earthquakes that just happen, and, the tens of thousands that passed away in Turkey and Syria, God rest their souls, that I would call a traumatic, not just event, but a traumatic history even. But really, I mean, it's important to remember that no matter how traumatic something may seem, if people have each other and they're able to process their emotions, especially if they're able to immediately after the event, and to not program into their mind that the world is a dangerous place, because that's basically what happens when you get PTSD. Is it's just, you can't forget the trauma, and you just don't feel like the world's a safe place. And that's why it's so difficult, and it really changes the wiring of your whole body. So that's why it's really, helpful to do embodied therapies for PTSD to help, get back and reactivate all the parts of the brain and the parts that help you to change your emotional brain and calm it down. But I really think community is key. And another great book that I guess these Wednesday mornings will be coffee and books. But this one, I have not finished it yet, but it's actually by a professor at Ohio State University named Angus Fletcher. And it's about how literature affects our brains. Well, not just literature, like theater as well. And he talks about how theater, like really traditional theater from, ancient Greek times, almost has an effect like to process trauma. The way that they were choreographed, and the songs and the things, and being in community while you're watching the traumatic thing happen on stage affects the brain to kind of offload that fear electricity going through the nervous system, and that's, so he's a neuroscientist that teaches English, so he makes those connections really amazingly throughout this book, and with all different kinds of literature. The last chapter I read was on Frankenstein, which was one of my favorite books. And yeah, so empathy is something that takes major brain power. It's, it's where, we do all the kind of higher level thinking in our brains, you know, um, thinking about like planning consequences, but also thinking it takes work to do it. Um, that's another huge takeaway from Never Split the Difference is really like appreciating the importance of asking for what you want and what that really means. Like, if you prepare, it makes such a huge difference for asking for what you want. And I guess my real takeaway is you have to prepare. Like, you have to anticipate the objections of people and be ready to address them. So you had to have really done big brainstorm. If it's a really important negotiation, which, I mean, what negotiations aren't important, really? You know, like, one of the things I'm working on in my own personal growth is just becoming more in tune with what I want and asking for what I want more effectively. And actually, that relates back to um, Vanderkolk's book as well, because one of the effects of PTSD is not having access to wants and needs, like cutting that off. That's one of the effects of PTSD. So that's a huge challenge, if you don't, because one of the keys in effective um, negotiation, one of the keys is just having a clear goal that you're going for. And what Voss says is you're going through a discovery process with someone else so they can discover that actually your goal is what is their goal as well. That's actually what you're doing. And he really shows how that's possible throughout the book, which is amazing. And he's also, I want to emphasize, it's not about manipulation. It really is ethical, because if you are unethical or you are manipulative, you'll lose your reputation and you won't be able to negotiate effectively with anyone. So it's really the opposite, being manipulative. It's actually the opposite of that. So it's really, read the book. It explains that it's it really will undo a lot of your thinking. And yeah, just think about, I hope that, after listening to this, you'll think about communication differently too. And that, there are ways to communicate that get things done, get what you want. And, they're transformative ways of communicating. And this is just, a negotiation is just one of them, but I think it's a great starting point for anyone wanting to develop their communication skills, because it's just, the building empathy thing is just so core to being a human. I wish I would have read this book years ago. Another book I highly recommend in terms of this, and probably I'll be recommending these books a lot throughout this podcast because I am constantly rereading them and learning them. But you may have heard of Gottman. I think it's John Gottman. But he's famous for being able to predict whether a marriage will last by just observing a couple for like 5 minutes. That's kind of, I just remember he was in the news for that at one point, but he's written some amazing books, and his research is fascinating. It's not just his, he's got a whole team. I think his wife also does some of the research. I'm not sure, but he talks about bidding, and in his book, The Relationship Cure, everyone should read it. He explains how you have 3 options, and people are constantly bidding, and you can either turn toward their bid, turn against it, or turn away. And it could be pass the salt, or it could be give me a hug, or, it could be how are you feeling and wanting to start a conversation. Bids could be for, they're just asking for some kind of engagement, attention, or interaction, And if you ignore a bid, that is actually worse than like saying no or putting someone down, which also reinforces this idea of no being a valuable thing. Like it's even better to insult someone than to ignore their bid. Like according to Gottman's research, like even couples who are really negative to each other, if they're responding to their bids, they're still much more likely to last than a couple that is not responding to each other's bids, because we just have this really strong need to feel seen and listened to and understood, you know? So when I read that book, and that was in around the time of 2008, when I decided to become a happy person, one of the things I realized was that I needed to, I don't know, I just wanted to be more social, I guess, and really understand relationships better, you know, and their role in my life. So I happened upon a friend of mine recommended that book. And it really helped me in terms of just like giving me a basic unit. And again, it's a hard skill a lot of the times. It's a code, you know, like a bid is, I mean, it's basically like decoding human communication. Like anyone in any way tries to capture your attention and you have that option to respond, they're bidding for engagement, you know. And actually those bids are what make up relationships much more strongly than like deep, intimate conversation. It's not that there's no place for that. Deep, intimate, transformative conversations are amazing. And, you know, it's what I live for. It's one of the reasons I started a podcast, because I want to have a place to kind of channel that energy. But no, I mean, just feeling acknowledged, all the little things literally are what make the relationship. That is the actual core of the relationship and what makes it last, even if you don't have any like deep conversations, which, you know, that was a big revelation from his research, because even psychologists thought that relationships really relied on deep, intimate sharing, and that's what a marriage needed and stuff like that. And I think that's debatable, you know, and I think that's a beautiful aspect of having a long-term and, you know, committed and yeah, like those core, not just marriages, but like those core friendships and relationships in your life. That's the beautiful part about them, is those deep conversations. And when you can be authentic, that's really powerful as well. So yeah, I think we need to place more emphasis on these skills, these hard skills of communication. And also, you know, I mean, in my own life, I'm going to put more time into preparing for negotiations, just thinking about, in any situation, it is a negotiation too, like kind of, it helps me. The other thing he talks about are negotiating styles. And I think I'm an accommodator, I was like, ding, ding, ding. Oh, I see how things go wrong for me a lot of the time. You know, like I have strengths. We'll have strengths, kind of natural strengths and natural weaknesses for negotiation. So I really recommend you read the book. I do need, it is 7 a.m. now, and I got to get working on some other stuff, but I didn't want to make this too long. So I think this is a good time to wrap it up, and I will talk to you later. Thank you so much.